Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We're so happy that you're here. Nancy Horton, my colleague, and I are going to talk about service animals today. And we are really excited because we frequently get calls about this topic, and we love to set the record straight and answer people's questions. So, next slide, please. Slide 11. As Emily said, we are the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. We are one of 10 regional centers, number 3 on the map there, providing guidance, training, and materials on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Our phone number is 1-800-949-4232. And if you have an area code that is within the Mid-Atlantic region, you will reach our office. Otherwise, you will be connected to the center that serves the area code you're calling from. Our website is adainfo.org, and we are funded by a branch of the Health and Human Services called NIDLR, the National Institute of Disability Rehabilitation and Research, to provide the training and guidance and materials on the ADA. Next slide. I want to say at the outside, neither Nancy nor I are attorneys. Nancy, I was thinking about it earlier. I think between the two of us, we have about a combined 60 plus years of experience talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we definitely know what we're talking about, but we're not attorneys, and nothing we say here should be construed as legal advice. It's for information only. Okay, now we get down to the good stuff. Nancy, tell us, set the stage for us. Where do service animals come into play when we talk about the ADA? I know they come in throughout the law, but what are we biting off today? What are we talking about today?
What are we biting off today? That's good. We're not going to bite. We're not going to bite today, but we are going to have a focus today under the ADA. We're really focused today on Title II of the ADA, which covers state and local governments and everything they do, all their programs, services, and activities. And we're also going to focus on the bulk of Title III, which addresses private businesses in a couple different ways. But the bulk of that is really about what we call public accommodations, which include a variety of types of private businesses that are open to the general public, that offer goods and services to the general public. So some examples here on this slide: retail stores, restaurants and bars, hotels, theaters, gas stations, banks, amusement parks, fitness centers, daycare centers, the offices of professionals of like doctors and lawyers, and insurance agents, real estate agents, things of that nature, and many others. These are just examples. So the coverage here is relatively broad. And these two titles have some distinctions, but they also have some things that are very similar or have in common. And one of them is the way that they address service animals. So on our next slide, one of these things where these two titles have the same fundamental requirement, one of the real core requirements of these titles is the obligation for covered entities. And when we say covered entities, we're talking about the state and local government agencies that are covered by Title II, and the private businesses that are covered by Title III. They're offering their goods and services to the public. And they have this obligation to make reasonable modifications in their policies, practices, and procedures in order to ensure equal opportunities for people with disabilities. So that's a real that's something they have in common. And this little image on the slide is kind of illustrating the example that we're talking about today. You know, lots of places have policies like no dogs allowed, no pets allowed. It's a common policy. So they might need to make a modification of that kind of a policy.
Okay, one thing that we get a lot of questions about, and it's kind of hard to keep track of and remember, are there are really two different definitions of service animals within the Americans with Disabilities Act. Can you tell us about these two different definitions and how they apply?
Absolutely. And on our next couple of slides, if we move to slide 15, we'll see one of the definitions that we have is from the U.S. Department of Transportation, which regulates all of the regulations that apply to vehicles and facilities of any transportation services that are covered by these titles we're talking about today, Title II and Title III. So the DOT, they have their definition of a service animal, and it says that it's any guide dog, signal dog, or other animal individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. So just kind of keep that definition in mind for a moment. And when we move on to our next slide, number 16, we find the U.S. Department of Justice's definition, which would apply in all the other types of businesses or agencies covered under these titles. That's not a transportation program or service. Everywhere else covered by these titles, this is the definition that's going to control. And it says that a service animal is any dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability. So if you remember back to the DOT definition that we just mentioned, it's very much the same, but it's not limited to just dogs.
Okay, so what about other animals?
Well, and we move on to our next slide, we can look at some of the additional features that the Department of Justice talks about in their definition. You know, they start out by saying it's a service animal is a dog, and then they really want to clarify and underscore that any other species other than dogs, whether they be considered wild animals or domestic animals, you know, animals that we traditionally think of as domesticated, whether they're trained or not trained to serve people with disabilities, they are not considered service animals. They don't meet the definition of service animal for DOJ's rule. However, here's the however, on our next slide, we'll see that the Department of Justice has done something a little unique, even though their definition is limited to dogs. They added, when they updated their rules, regulations in the year 2010, they said covered entities may need to make reasonable policy modifications to allow an individual with a disability to use a miniature horse that has been individually trained to perform disability-related work or tasks.
So, okay, let me get this straight. We're talking Department of Justice rule. We're not talking Department of Transportation rule right now. We're talking Department of Justice. Service animals are dogs, and in some cases, miniature horses. Well, miniature horses and dogs are very different animals. So does justice take this into consideration?
They do. And on our next slide, I think we can see some of the what the distinction that they sort of established. You know, what is the difference between these? Obviously, we know they're different animals, but how do we sort of view and address them differently when people are bringing these animals into places that are covered by DOJ's rule? So on our first bullet, we'll see that, you know, service dogs must be allowed in virtually all areas where the public is allowed to go. There are very few exceptions. There are very few areas or spaces or places where a service dog could be excluded. You know, the person with the disability would not be allowed to bring that service dog with them. A couple of examples: an operating room or burn unit in a hospital where sterility is very important and very difficult to maintain. Limited areas potentially in a zoo where the animals in the zoo's collection, the animals on display, might be the natural predators or prey of dogs, and it might cause the animals to become upset or agitated or aggressive or something of that nature. So that's those are a few examples, but mostly, if it's a service dog, it's gonna be allowed to be in all areas under Titles 2 and 3 where DOJ's rule controls. So it's going to be lots of public places, voting locations, and public schools, and city hall, and courthouses, and lots of private businesses, restaurants, stores, and things of that nature. Where miniature horses, on our next bullet, the operators of facilities can make a few additional considerations before allowing a miniature horse, including the type, size, and weight of the miniature horse, and whether the facility can really accommodate, the miniature horse. I will say that generally, most, miniature horses are not larger or heavier than large dogs, than really large dogs. So it doesn't, in the real world, it doesn't come into play a lot, but it is a distinction. It is this allowance that the Department of Justice made for people with disabilities to be able to use these very particular type of animals, which are domesticated, trainable, have long lives, because a lot of people with disabilities, for a number of reasons, aren't able to use dogs, to use service dogs. So it's a very kind of narrow consideration here for miniature horses under DOJ's rule.
Okay, now let's get back to dogs. And what makes a dog a service animal or service dog as opposed to any other dog?
That's a great question. And on our next slide, I think we'll look at some of the things where we sometimes, some basic information and some areas where we tend to see some confusion sometimes. Again, and we sort of mentioned this in the definitions, both DOT's and DOJ's definition require service animals to be trained. They need to be trained to perform specific actions, tasks, work that are directly related to an individual's disability. So service animals are active animals. I mean, they're not active every minute, but they're trained to take action and do work. So that's a really important basic thing. Now, on our next slide, we'll look at some examples of what we're talking about. When we say tasks and work, they might provide physical support and help with balance and stability for people who have mobility disabilities or gait issues, unsteady gaits or something. Some folks like this often tend to use large or strong dogs or miniature horses that can help support them. Service animals might guide individuals who are blind or have low vision. This is a pretty common example that most people are familiar with. We had, so-called guide dogs and so forth. We've had them for many, many years and decades. So most people are familiar with that. Service animals might pull wheelchairs or retrieve items for people with mobility limitations. They might alert individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing to sounds by taking actions that alert people and sometimes indicating the direction, for example, of where a sound is coming from. They might be trained to take actions that would prevent or interrupt behaviors for people who have psychiatric or neurological disabilities. Some service animals are trained to alert individuals to things like oncoming seizures, changes in blood sugar levels, or other sort of physiological things of that nature. They might provide nonviolent protection work, and that's a very important phrase. There was a lot of discussion around this when the Department of Justice updated their rules in 2010. They really wanted to make it clear that a service animal is not an attack dog, so-called. It's not what some people might consider a protection dog, or even a rescue dog that's just trained to do sort of general rescue work by pulling people out of the ocean when they're drowning, or a pool, or bringing the brandy to the people stuck in the snow, and those kinds of things, but trained to do specific things for a specific individual that might help with response, rescue, protection when somebody might experience, for example, something like a seizure. So those are some examples, just some examples of the kinds of tasks that service animals might do. So on our next slide, we want to touch on this issue of other types of assistance animals or working animals, because there are other types of either working animals or animals that may even assist people with disabilities, but they're not service animals under these two titles of the ADA, according to those definitions. So on our first bullet, for example, we have emotional support or comfort animals. These are a couple of names that people sometimes call animals which provide comfort, companionship, emotional support, or other benefits to individuals with disabilities, or a particular individual with a disability, simply by being present. They're not trained to really do anything specifically. They don't do tasks. They just, sort of provide some companionship. And on our next bullet, therapy animals. And sometimes we see people use these different terms in different ways, or sort of interchangeably from what we're talking about here. But this is the way most of us in ADA land think of these terms.
Yeah, and I was going to say that it gets really confusing, because people can be talking about an animal in a housing situation, which is another law entirely, and so we have to know when we're in ADA land and when we're not in ADA land. So
exactly. And even sometimes, we just hear people, I've talked to a lot of people who, they're really describing what I would call an emotional support animal, right, or a comfort animal, but they call it a therapy animal. But we tend to think of therapy animals as animals who are trained to provide comfort or socialization to general populations, not to a specific individual. Very often these are animals, they're trained and they're taken into nursing homes or schools or hospitals or something of that nature, and they just socialize with whoever's there, with anybody who would like to snuggle up with the dog, or spend a little time with the dog. So that's what we tend to think of as therapy animals. And then on our final set of bullets on this slide, we want to take note that there are other laws, including state laws, that in some cases extend greater rights to individuals with disabilities who use various types of assistance animals. So it's always good to keep in mind, what we're talking about here. We've sort of outlined what Title II covers, what Title III covers under the ADA. And there are lots of other laws and other situations where other laws may come into to play. So with that,
And vocabulary is so important because you really have to ask clarifying questions in order to figure out which law are we talking about, which title are we talking about, and what exactly is required. And sometimes that takes some time to do. And we often get calls, lots of calls with people
yes,
who are
yeah,
confused, very confused, because it is confusing. It is confusing for anybody,
absolutely. Yeah, if people are confused, I say you're in good company because it is confusing. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, and I mean, even under Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA, we have two definitions of service animal. So, you know, you could literally be on the city bus with maybe one type of service animal, you know, it could be a cat or something, and then you get to the grocery store and your cat is likely not going to be admitted because in the grocery store it needs to be a dog or maybe a miniature horse. And so it really is confusing. And when you then understand that there are other laws that cover other situations, sometimes there's overlap. So it can be confusing for folks. It really can. But that's what we're, you know, trying to help folks just get a framework of this piece that we're talking about today with under these titles of the ADA. So if we look at our next slide,
I was just going to say we have questions coming in, which are great, and we look forward to answering them at the end. We're going to present all our information first, as Emily said, and then we will answer the questions. Lots of good questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. And some of the questions may be answered before we get to the end, because we do still have a few more slides. So on this slide, we wanted to provide an example of sort of what we were talking about with the training and the tasks piece. So on the first side of the slide here, our first example is of a service dog. Marge has a psychiatric disability. Her dog, Bumper, can tell when Marge's anxiety level begins to rise. When Marge starts becoming anxious, Bumper can tell. And Bumper is trained to respond to that by moving himself in front of Marge and leaning against her to help direct her away from her current location. Now, on the other side of the slide, our next set of bullets shows us an example of not a service dog. Aaron has a psychiatric disability also. His dog, Floppy, is good-natured and sometimes can even tell that Aaron is becoming anxious. However, Floppy isn't trained to do anything to help Aaron. He doesn't respond to Aaron's anxiety. So that's not a service dog. Aaron might find some comfort, for example, with Floppy being around, but Floppy's not a service dog because he's not doing anything. He's not doing any action or task or work when Aaron becomes anxious. He's not trained to do that.
Okay. All right. So riddle me this. We see Bumper and Floppy out in public. There's Bumper and Floppy. How do we tell the difference? I mean, you know, okay, maybe one has a harness, the other one doesn't, but they could look identical. So how do we know the difference?
They could. Well, and we're going to talk in a minute about what questions, covered entities, operators of businesses and so forth can ask people. I mean, but this is just giving us an example of the distinction that's so important, the training,
right, the
action that makes a dog a service animal. But you're right. They could look exactly the same. They could be siblings, the dogs themselves, really, but one is, a service dog because it's been trained to do a task and the other one hasn't. So that's why sometimes out in the real world, people have to have a little bit of a conversation
Right.
about that to figure that out, because you really can't tell consistently by any particular, method, or if the dog is wearing something or something like that. There's no real consistency about that. And we're going to talk a little bit more detail about that. But on our next slide, we'll be up to number 24 at this point. So entities covered under Title II or Title III may ask two questions, and only two. When a person is accompanied by a dog or a miniature horse, or if it's in a transportation setting, it could be another type of animal. So the first question they could ask, our first bullet here of our questions, the first question that covered entities can ask, it's coming, folks, it's coming. Emily's there it is. The first question is this a service animal required because of a disability? So that's basically a yes or no question. That's, somebody comes in, just have a dog, miniature horse, on the bus or something, it might be a different animal. And if the person says, yes, this is a service animal, the second question, the follow-up question that can be asked is, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? So that's question number 2. So this is where the individual with the disability needs to say, what is the task or work that the animal's been trained to perform? Keeping in mind that it needs to be an action, it needs to be a task, and not necessarily the result of the task, but the task itself. What does the animal do? Again, we saw a bunch of examples earlier. It alerts me. It retrieves things for me. It, things of this nature is what we're going to generally hear in response to this question. So if we think back to the example we talked about with Bumper and Floppy, sometimes this is where we see a little bit of confusion for folks, because sometimes covered entities or people with disabilities don't necessarily really understand the focus of this question. And sometimes they answer that's really more about the result. They say, well, Bumper keeps me calm. And that's really the result. But what is Bumper doing? How does Bumper help you stay calm? Right. What is Bumper doing? Bumper applies pressure. He leans on me. He licks my hand. That's what we're really looking for here with this question, is what is the animal doing? So I think there's maybe one more bullet on this slide that reminds us that either of these questions really should only be asked when the answers aren't obvious. If you see somebody coming in and they use a wheelchair, and, a miniature horse is clearly pulling the wheelchair or something, you don't need to ask either one of these questions. It's clearly the animal is pulling up a wheelchair, and we don't need to ask that. But very often we can ask these questions because it's not obvious. Our next slide, and we may have more questions about this later. There are some things that can't be asked and should not be asked. Covered entities cannot ask for documents, certificates, proof, demonstrations, or details about the individual's disability or the animal's training. It's really just the two questions. And if the person answers those questions, this is my service animal, it's trained to alert me, guide me, whatever, we're not going to say, can you demonstrate that? Do you have a certificate that proves that the animal was trained by a professional, or any of that? None of that can be asked. Certainly not, what's your disability? That's not, again, some people will sometimes volunteer more information than they need to provide, but if the two questions are answered, then we move on until or unless we have some kind of an issue.
Okay, so a lot of people, one of the biggest misperceptions about service animals is people believe that they need to have an official ID that says they're a service animal, and that this ID is provided by the Department of Justice or the Department of Transportation, or they can get an official certification online. And there are a lot of businesses online that are offering that paperwork, etc. So do service animals have to wear something specific? Do the owners have to have ID of some sort? What's the scoop with the identification?
Yeah, well, mostly no to most of that stuff. And I think on our next slide, we talk about that a little bit. We'll be up to slide 26. First of all, the departments, of transportation, the Department of Justice, they don't issue certificates or, any of that. They don't do anything like that. You mentioned that now some states have traditionally have requirements. A service dog should be on a leash of a particular color and various things. Again, under these parts of the ADA, if you're covered, you can't require those things. Many service animals wear harnesses, vests, and other items that identify them as service animals, and that's fine if people want to purchase these kinds of items. Some people feel like it's a really good idea to have some identification on their service animals. You may have seen vests that also have information for the public. Please don't distract me. Please ask before you pat me. Things of that nature, because these are working animals. But all of these things cannot be required. Those are options that individuals with disabilities may want to use, but they're not required. And something that's just, purchased, you purchase an ID or a certificate or a vest, or doesn't mean anything in terms of under these parts of the ADA. It doesn't, you just can't say, if somebody says, well, what is your animal trained to do? An individual with a disability can't just say, well, you see it has a vest on. Doesn't really,
it doesn't prove anything.
No, it doesn't. No, doesn't really mean anything. You still have to answer the question, what does it do? So
right.
That's really important. We do tend to see a lot of confusion around those kinds of issues. Business operators and covered entities asking to see certificates and documents and registrations and all these things that aren't, can't be required. And especially when there's a requirement in a state law that says they should be wearing a certain color, or then it's sort of understandable that people would ask for those kinds of things. But if the place is covered by the ADA, these places we're talking about, then it's really down to the two questions.
Okay, now we both know very well that there were a lot of businesses that were concerned about having to let service animals into their place of business. And they were concerned because of crowds, because of something might trigger poor behavior in the animal. So what can the business owners and the state and local government people expect as far as the service animals' behavior in their place of business, place of work?
Yes, well, that's a great question. And I think on our next slide, we have some bullets that really get at this issue. Covered entities have, rights and responsibilities on their side, just like people with disabilities have both rights and responsibilities on their side of things. And both the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice talk about expectations, service animals, miniature horses, or whatever service animals we're talking about here. They need to be housebroken. They need to be under control of their handlers at all times. They should be on a harness or a leash or a tether, unless there are only two reasons really where they might not be, and that's okay. And that's if the individual, due to their disability, is unable to use a leash, or the leash would interfere with the animal's work. So, and some service animals might be on a leash much of the time and then need to be let off their leash to do their task or some part of their task. They need to retrieve something, or they're a service animal that's going to go ahead of their handler and go into a room or a space and check it out and make sure it's a safe space and come back and alert the handler that that's a safe space for them to now go into. So that service animal is probably going to be maybe let off the leash so they can go and do that. But for the most part, service animals are going to be on a harness or a leash or something, but it doesn't necessarily have to have a bunch of insignia or things all over it, but they need to be under control. And if they're not on a leash, they still need to be under control. They need to be controlled by voice commands, hand signals, or whatever is effective. They shouldn't be, out of control. And on our next slide, I think we talk about some examples of what that might look like. Handlers are responsible for the care and supervision of their service animals. It's never the responsibility of a covered entity to provide care or supervision for a service animal. If people with disabilities are going to have to go somewhere where they might need to be temporarily separated from their service animal, and they know that ahead of time, they're going for some medical test or something of that nature where they're not going to be able to bring their service animal in there, then they probably are going to need to make arrangements. They're either going to need to bring someone with them or leave their service animal at home or something, because the staff at the medical facility are not going to have to take over supervision of the service animal while the individual has to be separated. So covered entities can exclude service animals if they're out of control, they're not under control, or if they pose a direct threat to health or safety. A direct threat is a pretty serious thing,
right?
But being in control or being out of control isn't necessarily the same thing as a direct threat. There are certain types of behaviors that would be a direct threat. Obviously, snarling and snapping and biting and things of that nature would certainly be unacceptable and both out of control and, possibly a direct threat. But there are other behaviors that are just out of control and don't need to be tolerated. We have a couple of images on this slide of a dog who's eating off a table in a restaurant, having a waffle there off a table in a restaurant. Another dog that's been placed up in the child seat of a shopping cart. And those are things that they might not necessarily be a direct threat, but they're not behaviors that need to be allowed. Service animals don't have to be allowed to sit up at the table or, do those kinds of things, or even just wandering around, being out of control, certainly running around, jumping, of course, not being housebroken. Even animals get ill sometimes, but when these kinds of behaviors take place, facility operators can ask people to remove the animal from the premises. The person could come back without the animal, but the animal might need to be removed if they're really out of control. So that's That's important for everyone to understand that.
So at the beginning, you alluded to other laws that might like overlap with the ADA in terms of service animals and requirements. So can you talk a little bit about the other laws?
Well, we do have, and I think on our next slide, we give an example, just a couple of examples of where laws that might overlap, where one is better for individuals than another. And in a case like that, the individual with a disability gets the best of whatever is available to them. So we look at laws and we look at them piece by piece to see which provisions are better for individuals, and that's what the individual gets. So for this example here on our slide, where we have overlapping laws, we've got Title II or Title III, and then we've got a state law. So under the ADA, a service dog could be any breed of dog, any size of dog. It just has to be a dog. But there's a state law that prohibits ownership of bulldogs. Can't have a bulldog
Wow.
in this state. So if somebody has a bulldog that's a service dog, that state law is going to fall by the wayside when they go to take their service dog that happens to be a bulldog into, the grocery store, the city hall, what have you. The facility operators can't say, well, you can't bring that in here, even if it is a service dog, because it's a bulldog and bulldogs aren't allowed in this state. The ADA is gonna win the day on that one. On the other hand, on the other side of our slide here, under Title II and Title III of the ADA, a service dog has to be trained. We mentioned that in both definitions. Service dogs have to be trained. That's past tense. They are fully trained. Whereas a lot of state laws extend protections to people who are training service dogs. So a state law might require that a business, for example, allows somebody to bring in a service dog that's in training. It's not trained yet. It's in the process of being trained. And of course, it's hard to train a service dog that's going to need to be in public spaces if you can never take it into public space, right? To practice. So a lot of state laws extend this kind of consideration for people who are training service dogs. And the trainer doesn't even have to be a person with a disability. It's just could be just a service dog trainer. The ADA doesn't do that. The ADA doesn't require that a business let somebody in who's just training a service dog. It has to be a trained service dog. And so in that case, the state law is gonna win the day for a person who's in that situation, a person who's training, in the process of training a service dog. So this is just one
That was one of the
example.
questions that we had too. So we answered that one. So it's a
Good.
good idea for everybody to learn about how their state law addresses service animals, so they can be aware of any of those overlap areas and which would trump the other one.
Exactly, because sometimes they're different. And then we also have other laws. We even have other federal laws that address service animals or other types of assistance animals. We have the Fair Housing Act. We have the Air Carrier Access Act. We have some other laws that apply in other situations. We even have, under the ADA, we have Title I, which
Right.
addresses employment. And sometimes a person might request that their employer allow them to bring an animal into the workplace.
Right.
With them. And that's very different from what we're talking about here. We're talking about this, these couple of pieces of the ADA. We're talking about the public, customers, clients, patients, what have you, bringing service animals into these, the state and local government and the private businesses. So it's a very specific area of focus that we have. And I think we might be at the end of our
Well, we have
slides.
resources.
Right. We do want to share some resources. You know, again, we've mentioned the Department of Justice and the Department of Transportation. We provided some links here to their websites, and we put handouts of our slides up on our web page. I think folks got the link to that in the notification email that you received about today's session, so you can access those, and these links will be live active links in those handouts, so you can visit these websites. The Department of Justice has some very good, very user-friendly guidance and technical assistance materials about service animals under their rule, and the Department of Transportation also has information, and their regulations and everything are up there on their websites.
Yeah, you have to kind of be very careful when you go on the web and you search service animals, because there's a lot of information out there. So you really want to kind of curate the information that you're reading to make sure it's accurate and up-to-date information.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one good reason to go to these sources. If you have questions about service animals under Title II or III of the ADA, you're not going to go wrong with going right here to the horse's mouth, shall we say?
The miniature horse's mouth.
Exactly, the miniature horse's mouth. I mean, there's a lot of other good information out there, but there also is, as you mentioned, Anne, you know, outdated information and incorrect information out there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention. We are the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. And, you know, I totally forgot to say, and I can't believe this, I think I'm just doing too many presentations. My name's Anne Deschamps. I'm the director of the ADA Center, and my colleague and partner in crime here is Nancy Horton, who is the associate director of the ADA Center. And as I said, we've both been providing training and technical assistance on the ADA for many, many, many years, and very happy to be working together on this. So, and we're really glad to answer questions. So our toll-free number with area code that is in the Mid-Atlantic region is 1-800-949-4232. Our local number, if you're in Delaware, DC, Maryland, PA, Virginia, or West Virginia, but you don't have an area code reflecting that, you want to dial 301-217-0124. And if you dial the 800 number from anywhere in the country, you get connected to the center that serves the area code you're calling from. Our website is adainfo.org, and you can email us at adainfo@transcen.org.